It started as an ordinary, sunny afternoon in the neighborhood, a perfect day for kids to play outside. Laughter filled the air as children kicked around a bright red ball, their excitement echoing down the street. But the cheerful scene took a sharp turn when the ball accidentally bounced into the yard of a grumpy neighbor, someone known for their short temper and lack of patience. What happened next left everyone stunned. Instead of returning the ball or simply brushing off the incident, the neighbor did something unthinkable. They stormed out, grabbed the ball, and marched back inside, slamming the door behind them. The kids stood frozen, their joy replaced with confusion and disappointment. Whispers spread among the children and parents watching from nearby. Who could be so cruel to a group of innocent kids? One father, however, wasn't about to let this slide. He calmly stepped forward, his expression firm but composed. With the children watching expectantly and the neighbor glaring from their window, tensions were high. What would he do? How would he handle this unexpected confrontation? Stay tuned to find out how one dad's actions turned this tense situation into something no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. The father took a deep breath as he approached the neighbor's house. The sound of children whispering in the background grew louder, and he could feel their eyes on him. They were all waiting to see what he would do next. He wasn't just standing up for his own child, he was standing up for the entire group of kids who had been wronged in such an unexpected way. It wasn't just about the ball, it was about respect, fairness, and the kind of world they were all raising their children in. As he reached the neighbor's gate, he paused for a moment, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't the confrontational type. In fact, he usually avoided conflict whenever possible. But this time, something inside him told him that he couldn't back down. Not when the kids were watching, not when the injustice was so clear. He knocked firmly on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, there was silence. Then the sound of footsteps approaching. The door swung open with a creak, revealing the neighbor standing in the doorway, arms crossed, a scowl on their face. "What do you want?" The neighbor barked, their voice cold and dismissive. The father's stomach tightened. He had expected this kind of response, but it still stung. "I came to talk about the ball," the father said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The kids were just playing, and it accidentally went into your yard. They were hoping you'd give it back." The neighbor's eyes narrowed, and they scoffed. "I don't have time for games." "It's just a ball, isn't it?" "It's not just a ball," the father replied, his voice growing firmer. "It's about respect. You can't just take things from kids like that." They were playing, minding their own business. The neighbor sneered. "Maybe if they stayed out of my yard, this wouldn't have happened." The tension in the air was thick now. The father could feel the eyes of the children on him, waiting to see if he would back down or stand his ground. He could hear the faint whispers of their voices, and he knew they were watching, hoping he would do something. He wasn't just representing himself anymore. He was representing all of the parents who had let their children play freely, trusting that everyone would respect each other's space. "I understand if you don't want kids in your yard," the father said, trying to keep his tone calm, "but this isn't about that. It's about you taking something that didn't belong to you. You could have just handed the ball back, but instead you decided to keep it." The neighbor stepped forward, their face twisting in frustration. "You think I care about some kid's game? I've got my own problems. I don't have time to deal with this." "I get it," the father said, his voice softening slightly. "But this isn't about your problems. It's about doing the right thing. You're an adult. You're supposed to set an example." The neighbor's eyes flashed with anger, but before they could respond, the father heard a faint voice from behind him. It was one of the children calling out nervously. "Is everything okay, mister?" The father turned around to see a young girl standing a few feet away, her wide eyes filled with concern. She was clutching the hand of one of her friends, who looked equally worried. The father smiled gently at her, trying to reassure her that everything would be fine. But inside, his heart was racing. He had no idea how this would play out. The neighbor's gaze shifted to the children, and for a brief moment, there was something almost vulnerable in their eyes. But it was quickly replaced with bitterness. You think I care about a bunch of kids? They muttered under their breath. Just go away. It's my ball now. The father's patience was wearing thin. He had tried to reason with the neighbor, but it was clear that nothing would get through to them. The sense of injustice, of seeing his child and the other kids treated so unfairly, was overwhelming. He took another step forward, his voice low but determined. You don't get it, do you? He said. This isn't just about the ball anymore. It's about how you treat people, how you treat kids. You can't just walk around taking things because you're bigger or older or whatever. That's not how things work. The neighbor's face flushed with anger. You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through. Maybe I've had enough of people like you telling me what to do. The father's gaze hardened. He had heard this kind of excuse before, the "you don't know my life" defense. But it didn't change the fact that the neighbor had acted out of pure spite. It didn't change the fact that they had taken something that wasn't theirs and refused to give it back. I don't need to know your life, the father said, his voice unwavering. But I do know that this isn't the way to handle things. You're not teaching anyone anything good by doing this. For a moment, there was silence between them. The father could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had reached a crossroads. The neighbor wasn't going to give up the ball willingly. He wasn't going to back down either. Something had to change. As the tension hung in the air, the father heard the soft murmur of the children behind him, their voices barely audible. They were whispering to each other, unsure of what was going to happen next. Would the father give in? Would the neighbor back down? The father's mind raced. He knew he couldn't just walk away. The kids were counting on him. But at the same time, he didn't want to escalate things further. He had no idea how far the neighbor might be willing to go. He glanced at the neighbor, whose expression was now a mix of frustration and defiance. It was clear that they weren't going to give in without a fight. Suddenly, the neighbor's voice broke the silence. Fine, they spat. You want the ball? Take it. But don't think this is over. The father's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or more worried. The ball was back in the children's hands, but the tension between the two of them was far from resolved. The neighbor hadn't backed down completely. They were still angry, still resentful. As the father turned to walk back toward the children, he could hear the neighbor muttering under their breath. The kids ran up to him, their faces lighting up with joy as they reclaimed the ball. But the father couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. He could still feel the weight of the neighbor's glare on his back as he walked away. The situation had been defused for now, but it was clear that the conflict wasn't over. The neighbor had made it clear that they weren't done with him yet. And the father had no idea what the next chapter of this strange standoff would look like. As he returned to the group of children, their laughter filling the air once again, the father couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would the neighbor seek revenge? Would things escalate further? And most importantly, would the kids ever feel safe playing in their own neighborhood again? The answers to these questions hung in the air, just out of reach, leaving everyone in suspense, waiting for the next move in this increasingly complicated drama. The days that followed the incident with the neighbor were tense, though the father tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for his child and the other kids in the neighborhood. The ball had been returned, but the underlying tension between the two families lingered in the air like an unspoken promise of something unresolved. The children continued to play, but there was an unspoken understanding among them that the neighborhood had changed. The sense of safety they once felt was now clouded by the fear that something like this could happen again. The father, though, kept his focus on what mattered most: his child and the other kids. He didn't want them to feel like they had to hide or be afraid of playing outside. He wanted them to experience the simple joys of childhood, the kind of carefree moments that would stay with them for years. But every time they ran past the neighbor's house, the father noticed the unease in their eyes. The neighbor's presence, once a distant figure in their lives, had become a looming shadow. It wasn't long before the father realized that he couldn't just let this go. The neighbor had made it clear that they weren't done with him, and the children's fear was a constant reminder that things weren't quite right. The father had hoped that the situation would resolve itself, that time would heal the rift, but he knew deep down that wasn't going to happen. The tension would only grow if he didn't address it head-on. One afternoon, as the children played in the yard, the father stood at the edge of the driveway, watching them. He noticed how they kept their distance from the neighbor's house, their eyes darting nervously in that direction every now and then. He couldn't blame them. The neighbor had made it clear that they didn't want the kids near their property. But the father wasn't about to let fear dictate the way his child grew up. He wasn't going to let one person ruin the innocence of childhood. With a deep breath, he made a decision. He was going to confront the neighbor again, but this time it would be different. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let the neighbor's bitterness control the neighborhood. He needed to stand firm not just for himself, but for the children who had witnessed the injustice and were now feeling its effects. The father walked up to the neighbor's house, his heart pounding with each step. He had no idea how this would go, but he knew it was something that had to be done. He knocked on the door again, but this time there was no hesitation in his knock. The door opened and the neighbor stood there, arms crossed, looking as grumpy as ever. "What now? No," the neighbor asked, their voice sharp and defensive. "I think we need to talk," the father said, his voice calm but firm. "This situation isn't over, and it's affecting the kids. They're scared to play outside, and that's not right." The neighbor scoffed. "Oh, so now you're worried about the kids? After all the trouble they've caused?" "They didn't cause any trouble," the father replied, his voice growing more passionate. "They were just playing. They're kids. They're supposed to be outside, having fun, not worrying about whether someone's going to take their ball or yell at them." The neighbor's expression hardened. "You think I'm the bad guy here?" "I'm not saying you're the bad guy," the father said, trying to keep his tone measured. "But you've made it clear that you don't want the kids around. And that's not okay. This is a neighborhood. We're supposed to look out for each other." The neighbor didn't respond immediately. Instead, they just stared at the father, their eyes cold and unreadable. The silence stretched on, and for a moment, the father wondered if this was going to be another fruitless conversation. But then something shifted in the neighbor's expression. It was subtle, but it was there, a flicker of something that resembled regret, maybe even guilt. "I don't know what you want from me," the neighbor muttered, their voice softer now. "I want us to move forward," the father said. "I want the kids to feel safe again. I want them to be able to play outside without feeling like they're walking on eggshells. And I want you to understand that what you did wasn't right. You took something that wasn't yours, and you made the kids feel like they didn't matter." The neighbors sighed heavily, their shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just frustrated. Things have been tough for me lately." The father nodded, recognizing the vulnerability in the neighbor's voice. He had expected anger and defensiveness, but not this. It was clear that the neighbor had been carrying something heavy, something that had clouded their judgment. Maybe it wasn't just the ball. Maybe it was something deeper. "I get it," the father said, his voice softening. "Life can be tough, but that doesn't give anyone the right to take it out on others. Especially kids." The neighbor looked away, their gaze dropping to the ground. For a long moment, there was silence between them. The father waited, giving the neighbor space to process his words. And then, finally, the neighbor spoke again. "I'm sorry," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have taken the ball. I shouldn't have acted like that. I let my frustration get the best of me." The father's heart softened. This wasn't an apology he had expected, but it was the one he needed to hear. He nodded slowly, accepting the neighbor's words. "Thank you," the father said, his voice warm. "That means a lot." The neighbor gave a small, reluctant nod. "I'll try to do better. I don't want to keep causing trouble." The father smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. The neighbor had acknowledged their mistake, and that was something. It wasn't going to fix everything overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. As the father turned to leave, he glanced back at the neighbor's house. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of hope. Maybe things could improve. Maybe the neighborhood could heal. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like it was possible to move forward. When he returned to the kids, they were still playing, their laughter filling the air. The father watched them for a moment, his heart swelling with pride. They had been through a lot, but they were still here, still playing, still living their lives. And that was what mattered most. The days passed, and slowly but surely, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift. The children, once wary of the neighbor's house, started playing with more freedom again. They didn't forget what had happened, but they were learning to move past it. The father continued to keep an eye on the situation, but for the most part, things had settled down. The neighbor, though still a bit distant, seemed to have softened. There were no more incidents, no more tense confrontations. The ball had been returned, and with it, a sense of peace. As time went on, the father reflected on the experience. It had been a hard lesson, one that he hoped his child would never forget. He had learned that standing up for what was right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. He had learned that sometimes even the most difficult people could change if given the chance. And most importantly, he had learned that the safety and happiness of the children were worth fighting for. The neighbor, for their part, seemed to be taking steps to improve their relationship with the other families. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic apologies, but there was a quiet shift. They didn't yell at the kids anymore. They didn't take their balls. And that, in itself, was a victory. The father didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure: he would always stand up for his child, for the kids, and for what was right. And as long as they were together, they would face whatever came their way with strength, courage, and the kind of hope that could heal even the deepest wounds.